So I'm speaking with composer Siddhartha Khosla, whose music has been such a huge part of shows like The Royals, The Runaways, This Is Us, and The Kids Are All Right. His versatility and talents as a storyteller has made him such a standout voice in the industry and an incredibly in-demand composer. And Siddhartha, thank you so much for speaking today.
Honored to be talking to you, Kaya. Thanks so much.
So to start, I would love to know kind of your path to becoming a composer. Kind of what were those first moments that you remember from childhood that kind of triggered an interest in music or movies, if that was that early? And when in your life did it pivot into a career as a kind of film and TV composer?
Well, my parents left India in the late '70s, and left India to move to the United States and build a life here for them and their family. And I was born soon after that, and at the time, my parents were basically struggling to make ends meet. They were in school full time and they were working full time at night. So they didn't really have enough money to take care of me, and so they sent me back to India to be raised by my grandparents.
Oh, wow.
For the first few years of my life. I mean, they lived the quintessential immigrant story. They came to this country with $8, and and a newborn kid was too expensive at the time. So I tell that story because so much of my musical upbringing and so much of the music that I write even today is informed by those experiences, and particularly the Indian music that I heard growing up as a kid. I grew up listening to the music that my grandparents listened to, and finally when I came back to the United States when I was around 3 or 4, I was then listening to all the music my parents had brought with them on cassette tapes from India. And so my early childhood was just listening to these amazing Indian artists and singers, classical Indian music, pop Indian music, all sorts of stuff from like the 60s and 70s that my parents loved and passed on to me. And at a young age, my mom, for whatever reason, she recognized that I had a voice and I could sing, and that I had good pitch, and she started writing lyrics to Indian songs, popular Indian songs for me, and we would go to temple on Sundays, and my mom would be like, "Here, you're going to sing this for 150 Indian people," and that was kind of my introduction to music. It was singing in front of people and singing Indian music in front of people, and I spent the next several years of my life, singing Indian music, and it's all I did. I listened to Indian music and I sang it, and then in high school, I met a bunch of wonderful, friends, and they brought me into their band and introduced me to artists, like Western artists, introduced me to The Cure and the Smiths and the Beatles and all sorts of great music, and R.E.M., the Police, and then that started informing my Western sensibility. It started informing like the Western side of my music, and so then I had been informed from, there were two parts of my musical upbringing, and one part Indian, one part Western, and then that shaped kind of the way I wrote music, and I started writing songs, and I started a band after college, and I toured with that band for a while, and I made records that were some kind of Indian inspired. There was a little influence in the music, and so that was my, I had a band called Gold Spot. I still have the band. I don't really write records as much, but and we were on a label and toured, and that was wonderful. And then soon after that, when I was in my late 20s, no, maybe not late 20s, maybe I was in my like early 30s, I started thinking about a different path. And a producer, writer named Dan Fogelman called me and said, "Hey, would you like to score the second season of my television show called The Neighbors on ABC?"
Yeah.
I took the gig. I was reluctant because I just didn't know if I could do it, to be honest. I just didn't. I'd never really written for any visual media before. But I took that gig, and it was the best decision I made. And Dan ended up creating This Is Us.
Yeah, I mean that's the connection you have there. Were you aware of film music or TV music at the time, or was that a completely? Or how did Dan find you? First of all.
Well, Dan and I were college buddies.
Oh, nice.
And so we knew each other in college, and when I started my band career after college, he would come to shows and was a big fan of my music and just supported whatever I did. And we've been really good friends for a long time. But then while I was touring and making records, he was making film and making television, and our paths never crossed, really. It was always separate. We never really worked together or anything. Then finally he called me because they were looking for a new composer, and he said, "Would you want to come in?" And I said, "Sure." So there was a relationship before. It was a friendship that was there. Years before we even started working together.
Wow, I mean that must have helped, I guess, jumping into such a new territory. Did you feel like Dan gave you a little bit of a safety net when you kind of were trying to get your bearings on this kind of new career?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, it couldn't have been a more supportive situation. I think I hid it. Like, I hid at the time I hid the level of anxiety and stress I probably felt from doing that first project, because it wasn't just like that first project was straight to network television. It was.
Yeah.
And we were on a crazy schedule of delivering 22 episodes of this show, working every week to deliver, and it was an orchestral score as well. So there was a lot. It was pretty involved. It was mostly in the box, but still, it was like a lot of orchestrating to do. But yeah. So I think the safety net was definitely there to help guide me through that process. A lot of people were like, "Who's this guy?" and we've never heard of him, and who is he scoring our show? But ultimately, I guess people were happy with whatever we did, and so that was a huge learning lesson for me, and also a huge learning curve I kind of had to overcome, but I did it.
Yeah, I mean that's amazing. So, I mean, looking back at that, what tips would you have for composers who are kind of jumping into their first project? I mean, you have to, of course, you're going to encounter nervousness and maybe self-doubt and kind of all these maybe like looking at yourself, like, can I really do this? Where do you find the confidence, I guess, to finally say, okay, I'm capable and I can do this, and I have to deliver what's right for the show?
Well, I think part of it is that I began my career as an artist, making my own records and early on in my career, my music was discovered by DJs on KCRW in Los Angeles, which was like for me like a dream station to get my music played on. The DJs like Nick Harcourt, who Nick Harcourt discovered me on radio, and I think that when I was given kind of this like thumbs up early on in my career to say, hey, keep on doing what you're doing because it's cool or it's interesting. It's slightly outside the box, but do it. Those little moments give you an incredible amount of confidence that you carry with you forever. And I think, for me, the idea for me to, when I got involved in television and film, I think I've made a concerted effort to try to maintain as much of my artistry as I possibly can. I think that ultimately my favorite composers are the ones that have unique voices, and don't just do every genre. I think there's the beauty of what we do is that there's so many talented composers that do so many different types of genres and do them well. But then the composers that I look up to are the ones that have a unique voice, where you can almost hear the score and you're like, I bet you this person did it.
Yeah, absolutely.
You can hear an Alexander Desplat score from a mile away, just like you could hear John Williams' score from a mile away. But there's something identifiable. And so for me in my career, I've made a concerted effort to maintain that artistry as much as possible. And I think because I've also welcomed it, because I've I've also come in with, wearing my artistry shirt saying, I want to do something special and interesting here. I've started also attracting producers and writers that want the same from me
Right.
and are hiring me because of that. So, I think it's almost like this, it's a self-fulfilling thing for me, where I've put it out there that I want to be as artistic and do interesting work that I'm proud of as much as possible, but still serve the needs of the show and the directors and the producers, and I think ultimately it's been great because I get to work with showrunners who are like always are giving me the opportunity to do my thing first, to say, do what's coming to you first. Let's see what that is,
Yeah. Yeah.
And
No,
it could be wrong, but at least having that opportunity is important.
absolutely, and I think it's such a great thing to hear that because just from my point of view, I feel like kind of auteurs and kind of that individuality of the artist is dying a little bit. I think we're kind of in a world of brands and kind of kind of a general feel or general sound and when you say the word art, I feel like it kind of gets a like a negative reaction now. Like I'm an artist, and people go, "Oh, that's so pretentious." But I feel like you need to
Right.
embrace your individuality and see what you bring to the table too. And I mean, I'm glad that I hear that from you, and it's like you're trying to keep that kind of your musical identity alive, even though I'm sure you have to adapt to temp scores and kind of follow certain brands and stuff like that. So
Yeah, to be honest too, even with temp scores, I mean, we've on any project I work on, I actually I request that there's not a single ounce of temp score that I ever get to see. They can see temp score if they want, but I don't want to see it
right,
unless unless the producers or writers or creators of the show or movie, whatever, have something very specific in mind, which they rarely. I don't find that often. I'm finding that we're in an elevated age of television, particularly, and part of the reason why it's so elevated is that there's so many unique voices. There's and it's not just in the music, it's in the writing, it's in the direction, it's in the acting, it's in the stories that are being told, and I think that as we are moving into more diverse storytelling, especially, you are beginning to find way more interesting approaches to reaching that final product, and that the music plays a part in that too. And more and more scores that I'm hearing on television and film, especially TV, the more original stuff I'm actually hearing from other people too. And so it's exciting to see that because I think, the elevated content that seems to be out there is the stuff that doesn't feel or sound like everything else.
absolutely. No, I think TV it's where all kind of the middle class of filmmaking went to. It's these great auteurs telling these kind of long form stories and really having TV definitely I think allows the creators to shine a little bit more, at least today in 2019. um, yeah, I mean, so you're doing amazing work in TV, and you've worked on a number of amazing shows. But let's talk about This Is Us. And so you worked with Dan, kind of on The Neighbors, and then when he got This Is Us up and running, was it just did you get the call immediately, like, hey, I'm starting the show, I want you to score the pilot? Like, how did that kind of come up?
Well, I had done, so after The Neighbors, there were there were other shows and pilots that I had done between
Right.
for a number of years, and I'd done a bunch of pilots for Dan that didn't go to series. Then I'd done a bunch of other series and some comedies that had gone for other people, including Dan. And then finally, This Is Us came along, and he sent me the script for the pilot, and he said, "Hey, will you read this and write me a piece of music that just write me something, whatever the script is making you do, just can I hear reaction to it?" And I had to audition for the role. It wasn't like, you got this, because
Oh wow.
it was a priority project for them, for NBC, for the studio, and so and there were some heavy hitting directors coming on board, the pilot was directed by John Requa and Glenn Ficarra. Ken Olin was involved, and so you had these experienced directors who, like, they were bringing in like some heavy hitters, and so everyone had their own opinion on what the music should be, and everyone probably had their own people that they've worked with before as well. So there was, I had to really I had to really dig deep and earn it, you know. And
Yeah.
so I got that script, and I spent the next 2 days in the studio writing a 6.5 minute piece of score that I sent back to Dan, and he loved it, and the producers loved it, and the other directors loved it, and I was fortunate enough to get hired.
Wow, that's amazing. So let me talk about the pilot scoring process. I mean, I know during pilot season, composers are kind of jumping on different projects and stuff. But once you're working on a pilot and you have that first episode, how, I guess, is it challenging to find the sound of a show pretty much when you just have one episode and you kind of maybe have an idea of where it's going because you've talked to your showrunner and the directors and the writers, but with nothing else besides that first episode, what's kind of the process to find, I guess, the sound that was going to be kind of the foundation for what's to come?
Well, the key to finding the sound of any show is, really having an understanding of um, what there's a couple of things. It's knowing like what the producers like, first of all, like what is their sensibility, musical sensibility. That's important, because if you introduce something that is too foreign to everybody, sonically, that they're not used to, sometimes that might not work, But if they have, if you know what their sensibility is, like, and it's just more like general ideas, like how far left of center do they go? How far, how center do they want to be? Where is this? What was the approach? And I knew from the beginning, based on the directors that were involved, Dan, what they wanted to do. This was going to be a different kind of show. It was going to be special. Even though it was going to be on broadcast television, it was not going to feel like it was going to be like a network television show.
Right.
And it was going to feel like a film. And I also knew that Dan wanted to use Sufjan Stevens, a song by Sufjan Stevens in the pilot. So that guided me a little bit. And, that they were thinking of a Sufjan Stevens song. So I knew sonically that Sufjan lived in this, very organic space, and acoustic guitars, vocals, sometimes nondescript vocals, and his voice almost sounds like a little like a viola or something, like it's or cello. It's just so smooth,
Right.
very legato, and so it had that and so I was like, okay, so. When I read the script, I also realized that we were jumping around in time by the end of that pilot.
Yeah.
And the plan for series was that we were going to, the show is about this larger connectivity of life. It's about this idea that you're like, your ancestors made decisions that impacted their descendants, and ultimately you were impacted by it, and because you were impacted by it, your descendants will get impacted by it. And so it's this there's a butterfly effect kind of concept to the show, and because I knew that we were going to be jumping around in multiple timelines, I had to find something that was timeless and that didn't have a timestamp on it.
Yeah.
Because otherwise I might have potentially found myself cornered in a box every time, like we were in the 80s or the 90s. Was there going to then be a need to have a 90s sounding score or an 80s sounding score, whatever that even is?
Yeah, that could be really messy too.
It would have been messy, and it wouldn't have made sense. And with how complex the storytelling is in the show, with multiple timelines, multiple actors playing the same characters at different stages of their lives. I mean, so many things to think about. I had to find something that would make the show feel more cohesive. And so I opted for something organic and instruments that I could either play on my own or make on my own, something that felt timeless. So the acoustic guitar, for example, was a perfect example of how I use an instrument that could have been around 80 years ago, will be around 100 more, so that was important. So using instruments that didn't feel like they were trendy,
Yeah.
Even the percussion, I play all the percussion on the show on my wooden table, and it's all played with my fingers.
Wow.
And so there are these elements that are very organic, that contribute to the score. There's a cellist, and she's a beautiful player, and she plays Ginger Murphy. She plays all over the score as well. So we're using instrumentation that feels like it'll stand the test of time.
Absolutely. So I mean, yeah, the show you mentioned, it has a very unique structure of jumping in time and different timelines and different arcs. It's also very character based, and fueled by these amazing performances by the actors. What's the key to scoring? I guess performance. It's such a performance heavy show, and you're dealing with dialogue and the nuance of the performance, and of course the editing of these interactions. Is there a trick to navigating performance and dialogue versus scoring just straight up action within the frame?
Yeah, especially this show, where this show has so much emotional weight to it,
Yeah.
in the writing and in the performances, that I almost have to live on screen. I am kind of like I'm an invisible. I find myself to be sometimes like an invisible character on screen with the characters. Like I'm interacting with them in a way. Mm-hmm. But I find that I do a lot of listening, and to find the right emotional beats to hit. So to be more specific, if I'm watching a particular episode of This Is Us, and I know we're going to have like a 4 or 5 minute piece of score for a certain montage or a certain area, I will start with my acoustic guitar sometimes and just play along with the dialogue, just to kind of to find a rhythm and a pace first, right, because right. There's a clear rhythm to the I hear in the talking, in the dialogue, and then it's just weaving in the melodies at the right time. Dan loves melody and wants to hear melody in the score. He likes to have little hooks in the score. Wants you to leave an episode of the show and you hear like a little hook from the score kind of living in you for a while, and so you have to find the right times to bring that stuff in and out, and also it's a test in patience too, because you could easily go big and sweeping with the score on this show,
yeah.
An orchestra, and it might read as schmaltzy, and but then if I let my fingers do the work on my acoustic guitar, and I feel the emotional beats, and I keep the score in a place that in a way lives under the skin a little more, and shines when it's supposed to shine, then I find that it all feels more tasteful, and it's about finding that balance of when you want to be too big and when you want to be big, when you don't want to be big with the score, and so much of my process is listening and watching the dialogue, and I honestly don't. This is a very emotional score and a very emotional show, and I try not to. It sounds strange, but I try not to turn in any musical cue unless I feel like a little tingle in my spine. Yeah. And so I want to feel that. I want to feel that, and that's kind of my litmus test when I know I want a scene, or we want a scene to really hit home. It's finding that, it's making sure I feel that thing in my spine.
And I mean, you mentioned, it is a very emotional show, and there's these heavy moments, and yeah, you did take kind of a more kind of simple and organic approach, and you talked about, you don't want it to be too schmaltzy or melodramatic. I mean, how do you know when you get to that point? Do you have to kind of cross over the limit to know that you need to step back, or do you, like, where do you find the line not to cross, I guess is the question.
I don't know. I think it's just I think I try to keep myself in check as much as possible. I'm also the kind of person that watches something and I'm like, oh, that feels so cheesy, and I'll just say it out loud to myself. So I'm constantly on this cheese alert, and so I feel like in anything I do, not just This Is Us, any show I do, I'm always on. In anything, I'm very cognizant of it. I try to stay clear of it. I mean, this season of This Is Us, on the other hand, was wildly epic with the score. Yeah. So there were moments where it has to be big and sweeping, but it can be done in an interesting, cool way. You know, we had an entire Vietnam story this season that required me to kind of score battle scenes in Vietnam. You know, there's an episode where I had to score the story about Jack's brother, and the story of how Jack lost his brother in Vietnam. He always said he lost his brother in Vietnam, but his brother ended up surviving Vietnam. It's that their relationship did not survive Vietnam, and it's because the brother lost his mind there. I mean, and so there's an episode where the brother is high as a kite on a little canoe with a little Vietnamese boy, and as he's high, like a grenade falls out of his hand, and the boat explodes, and the kid gets blown up, and I'm scoring this entire massive sequence of that happening, and so, you know, there are moments where I had to completely stretch this season and go in a completely different space. I mean, I had to that scene. It was episode 311, I think it was called. Songbird was the episode, part 1.
Yeah.
And, you know, I was creating the sound of tinnitus by bowing on my vibraphone. You know,
Wow.
it was that kind of, it was really uncomfortable and unsettling. And you know, and it felt authentic to the moment. You know, that was a Vietnam scene. There was an explosion. You know, a little boy just died. It was tense, and it was maybe one of the most tense pieces of score I've ever written. But you know, so I got to those opportunities will also present themselves now on the show. You know, when you have a show with that many tentacles, anything is kind of possible.
Yeah, so has there been like a natural progression, I guess, over the course of the 3 seasons, or is it, since the storylines are kind of becoming, you know, the tentacles are getting longer, is it always kind of just changing, kind of providing new opportunities with like season 3? How is there a way to like see the progression of the score? Or is it just constantly kind of just a moving thing?
The score has evolved, and in a way that I never imagined it would have evolved. Okay, so there was an episode midway through season 1 where we see Kate, and we've just found out that we found out a few episodes earlier that her father had died when they were younger, and it ends up becoming this big mystery of the show, is how her father died, and any mention of the dad dying has all of a sudden became this very like haunting concept. It was really cool to see. I don't think Dan ever intended that to happen, but it did. But that became an important part of the series. And there's an episode where Kate is in a weight loss camp, and she's in a pound class, and they're sitting on a bunch of these yoga mats, and they're banging sticks on the ground. And in that process, she has a flashback to her childhood with her dad. And those images immediately break your heart, because we love this character, and we now find out that he actually does not live to be, he doesn't live in the future. He's done in the past. And then we see this flashback to the funeral, and it's the first time we've ever seen this, and it's a silent montage of the funeral. There's nothing happening. It is just dead silent. And all of a sudden, the score evolved into something Indian. And I started like playing that's where I really started playing my wooden table with my fingers and making, you know, I'm just playing like rhythms on my wooden table with my fingers. I was just basically watching it and just noodling along, and I'm like, oh, maybe I should record this. I recorded my fingers, and even some of the melodies almost started becoming a little more classical Indian. And without me even realizing, it was just happening. And then I remember Dan telling me that was a transformative moment in the score for the show. He's like, whatever happened there, he's like, that was a big moment. And then that unleashed this whole thing for the next couple seasons. And if you listen to the score, especially season 3, even a lot of season 2, there's a lot of Indian influence in the music now, in the score. And maybe it's because on some level I feel like, you know, the Indian music there's influences from Indian music that can help sell this larger connectivity of life, where it feels organic. It feels special. It feels original. It also feels me. You know, we
Yeah.
talk about bringing your own artistry into your work. This is a perfect example of that. Um, and it wasn't me forcing it in. It just I didn't start the series that way, but it has become that way.
I love that because I mean, yeah, you always see Hollywood kind of throwing like, oh, you use certain nationalities or cultures and their music for their location, and it's like, oh yeah, you're gonna take place in India, Indian music, but kind of bringing styles and flavors into something that's not necessarily like, oh, this is the stereotypical way to do it. It's I think that opens up so many different avenues. That's amazing.
Yeah, and it's just, and you would never think that. And I think that's also a testament to Dan Fogelman, you know, is his openness to push to push our limits as much as possible, and not even look at anything we do as having any limits. I think when you work with people that are more rigid and don't see beyond kind of what they know, it limits you. And I'm fortunate to work with people that are open.
Yeah, I mean that's amazing that you get to be you and create awesome stories and stories that touch people and work as a collaborative team. That's amazing.
I mean, in fact, I had to even have a conversation with Dan one time. I remember I said, "Hey, man," I said, "Is the music getting too Indian for you?" And he was like, "No, keep on doing what you're doing."
That's
And that was
awesome.
encouraging to hear because even if anybody, I was the one saying, "Hey, is is this gonna work? Is it okay for me to like have like this like Tanpura drone in the background that like sitar players play over at a concert, like meow, like just through an
Right.
entire Vietnam sequence?" And he's like, "Yeah, it's cool."
That's amazing. But to kind of wrap up and just kind of looking at your process overall, and I know this, I like to ask this question to composers, and I know it's going to be different for any project, but where does the first note come from? I know you mentioned with This Is Us, Dan provides you with a script, and you use that to kind of get your first ideas. But typically, where do you like to go for that first note to pull that first idea out? Do you like to wait till there's a first cut of whatever you're working on? Do you like to talk to the showrunner or the director and get that script early, or do you like to just focus on the characters? I mean, kind of where do you go for that inspiration?
I like seeing early images, like an early cut. Well, I mean, it could even be a photograph, honestly, of an episode. But I think normal a screenshot is fine for me. But I think normally I love seeing very, very early cuts of stuff. Even if I'm just sitting in the edit bay with an editor and just watching what they're doing for a few minutes, that helps me immensely. Um, and and that's where the first note comes from. If I watch an early cut, I will watch it from start to finish and just have a mic on in the room. And either I'll just hum something as I'm watching it, or I'll play my acoustic guitar and a melody will come out from there, or I'll get on my piano and play something. And then that inevitably will become the theme of the episode.
Wow.
That show is very thematic. So if you watch that episode, every episode plays like a little mini movie. And so there's a theme that kind of that weaves in and out of scenes, whether it's even a little transitional cue that may be 15 seconds long, or it's a 3.5, 4 minute scene that closes the show. You'll hear that same theme, that same melodic hook kind of take you through. So a lot of that's just coming from the first time I watch it, and I just play around, and I'm like, oh, okay, da na 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 na. Okay, that's my hook, and I'm
Hmm.
gonna do that, you know, in various incarnations throughout this.
Well, that's amazing. That's awesome.
Next.
But Siddhartha, I want to thank you so much for talking today, and congratulations on This Is Us and everything that all your body of work. But This Is Us is kind of it's become the show that kind of is launched into like superior pop culture, and everyone is watching it at the same time. That's such a becomes a community thing. So it's really amazing, and your music is such a driving force behind it.
Well, thank you so much, and really, really lovely meeting you, Kai, as well. Appreciate the support.